Garvey rise again. Take her from this evil den. Garvey rescue it from this ideology. Marcus Garvey rising from earth, like Moses picked from birth. Come children, say it loud, make them know we're still black and proud. Skabba-dabba-dab.
I'm black and I'm proud, I'm black and I'm proud, I'm black and I'm proud.
Skabba-dabba-dab.
I'm black and I'm proud, I'm black and I'm proud, I'm black and I'm proud.
African leaders just wait. Garvey action we can duplicate. Black pride him did preach. To the young we must teach. Put Garvey in reality. Make me check him philosophy. Talking about African dignity in a this insanity. Talking about our history that began before slavery. Come children, say it loud. Make them know we're still black and proud.
So my American experience began here in Michigan in 1969. I was telling Brother Abdul as we were coming from the airport earlier that my first experience of an American city was here in Detroit. I remember I was at Michigan State for a few months before I first took a trip to Detroit, and it was like, you know, being back home in the Caribbean, because it was the first time after having come to the States that I found myself in a largely black environment. And I remember feeling very much at home as I walked around downtown Detroit. I remember being impressed just by the way people walk. The rhythm of the place reminded me so much of home. You know, I kept seeing people who looked like people I had grown up with and so on. So Detroit, for that reason, has a very special place in my American journey. Detroit was also the first place that I ever taught in this country. I think it must have been the summer of 1970, I believe it was, when I taught a course at Wayne State University. There was some kind of a hookup that Wayne State had with Michigan State, and I was part of that program. So I taught a course here. I think it might have been the summer, it might have been the fall, but I think it was 1970. So in many ways then Detroit is like a kind of a homecoming for me. My topic for tonight, of course, is Marcus Garvey as a Renaissance man. That is a man of many talents. Paul Robeson once said that African Americans have a great talent for organizing. Robeson pointed out that of all the communities in this country, that the African American community is one of the most talented communities when it comes to organizing. And this is something that people don't often acknowledge. But I've always felt that one of the reasons why black folk here in North America have been able to survive, and to survive with a certain amount of style even, despite the unprecedented oppression and repression that black folk have had to deal with for 500 years. I've always felt that one of the reasons, one of the secrets for black survival in this environment has been this great flair for organizing. And we see this flair for organizing not only here in North America, but in fact throughout the Americas, you know, where black folk were scattered as a result of the Atlantic slave trade. We see that flair for organizing literally from day one. The first Africans who were brought to this hemisphere as enslaved Africans were brought to the island of Hispaniola in 1502. And almost as soon as they got off the ship, they began to organize, they began to move into the mountains, they began to set up what used to be called, what are still called maroon communities. These are communities of escaped slaves who were able to set up shop and establish a certain amount of independence and autonomy, and wage successful war against the slave owners. In many areas in the New World, maroon communities remained free and independent for hundreds of years. Some of them were never, ever captured. And just imagine the amount of organization it must have taken. You know, as slaves coming off a slave ship after 3 months in the Middle Passage, you know, chained in the bottom of a stinking slave ship, perhaps next to somebody from a different part of the continent who mightn't even have spoken your language. Imagine the feat of organization it must have taken for those people within a matter of minutes or days coming off that slave ship to be able to organize to the point where they could move into the mountainside, you know, into the countryside, into the mountains, into the jungles, organize a community, defend that community, work out strategies for providing for their sustenance, you know, agriculture, work out ways of defending the communities. And many of these communities were really excellent examples of organization. I remember reading of the Maroon communities in Suriname, in South America. And in Suriname, these people had, rice plantations growing. They had a variety of crops growing. They had their communities so fortified because they lived under constant threat of invasion from the white community. Sometimes, in order to approach the community, you had to actually swim underwater and whatnot. They were so well camouflaged, so well fortified. If they were attacked, they had systems in place whereby the women and children would be moved to safety before the European troops, arrived at the communities and so on. So you're talking here about a tremendous feat of organization from very, very early. In Brazil, you find the Republic of the Palmares in the 1600s, where the escaped Africans were able to set up an independent community, a republic, which lasted for about almost 100 years. The Republic of the Palmares in the 1600s in Brazil. And all over the Americas, you find the same thing. In this country, you find Africans running away from Georgia and running into Florida when it was a Spanish colony, and joining the Seminole Native Americans and so on, and setting up independent communities that were well organized, that fought effectively against US armies that were sent against them for many years.
That's right.
You find the same thing in Jamaica, where you had Maroon communities that were never defeated. Up to now, you still have some descendants of these Maroon communities still living in their own towns and so on in Jamaica. Marcus Garvey himself was a descendant of the Maroons of Jamaica. In the island of Dominica, in the Caribbean, you had Maroons who took over the island for several decades, maybe 60, 70 years. Dominica was actually under the control of Maroons. The same thing happened in the island of St. Vincent. For almost 100 years in St. Vincent, from the late 1600s to the late 1700s, you had Africans, again, literally coming straight off the ship. In fact, in the case of St. Vincent, these Africans were on a slave ship which was shipwrecked off the coast of St. Vincent. And they managed to break loose and get ashore. And that was the beginning of their organization. They were able to organize, they were able to make themselves militarily strong, they were able to ward off a variety of attacks from both the British and the French for 100 years before they were finally overwhelmed by the British. So you're talking here about a flair for organization that began practically from day one. You think in this country of somebody like Denmark Vesey in Charleston, South Carolina.
That's right.
Denmark Vesey in 1822, who took something like a year and painstakingly, meticulously put together an organization involving thousands of people who were enslaved in South Carolina. Unfortunately, at the moment when he was about to strike a major blow against slavery, as so often happens, somebody, kind of spilled the beans on him. Some little stool pigeon in the group went and told old master what was going on. But the white folks were amazed at what they found, because they found what they call a conspiracy, that had been in place for about a year, where thousands of people, on plantations all over, and these were people who were enslaved now, people who could not travel freely, people who could not leave the plantation at night without a pass. And yet, under those draconian conditions, these people were able to organize thousands strong and keep their organization quiet for a whole year, until the point where they were almost ready to strike a major blow against slavery. We have the case here of Nat Turner, perhaps the most successful and best known of the slave revolutionaries in North America. Nat Turner, 1831, in Southampton County, Virginia. A man who again demonstrated the same kind of organizational genius that we're talking about. At one point, Nat Turner actually escaped from slavery. He escaped, he was home free. And he came back voluntarily onto the plantation. And his friends asked him, what's wrong with you? You escaped, what you come back here for? And he told them that he was imbued with this idea that he had a job to do, and he was coming back to organize and do this job. He had a calling, he was called upon to do something. So here was a man who put this organizational desire above his own personal freedom. And a man who eventually struck with lightning speed in 1831, killed about 50-something to 60 white people in a single night.
Yeah.
In a single night.
All right, it's all good.
Gotta go. You have people like Will the Executioner, When you read the Confessions of Nat Turner, the other person, apart from Nat himself, who kind of emerges from the pages as a distinct personality, is a man described in the Confessions as Will the Executioner. Nat Turner refers to Will the Executioner with his fatal axe. Whenever he wielded that axe, somebody's head fell off. Will the Executioner. Nat Turner says that the night before the revolution began, when he and his fellow organizers, they retired into the woods. I think they slaughtered a hog and had a final meal and made their final preparations and so on. And Will showed up among them. So Nat says, well, he asked, Will, what you doing here? And Will said, my life isn't worth any more to me than yours or anybody else's. I've come here to strike a blow or die for freedom. So that was the kind of spirit, and that was what informed the kind of organization that went into the activity of somebody like Nat Turner, somebody like Will the Executioner. During Nat Turner's little uprising there were a couple of times when apparently the sword that he had was somewhat blunt. And Nat says there were a couple of times when he tried to kill some white person and the sword just bounced off the person's head or whatever. But whenever that happened, Will was always there with his fatal axe. One blow of the fatal axe all over. At the back of Nat Turner's Confessions, there's a list of all the people who were executed afterwards and killed and so on. And I looked through and I didn't see Will's name. So I would like to think that Will got away. His name isn't there among those who were executed and so on. So I fervently hope that Will was one of those who got away. Even during slavery, as you know, there were free black people. There were always small communities of free black people, even at the height of slavery, both in the North and in the South. And it's among those free black people, too, that you see some of that genius of African-American organization from very, very early. Africans in this country began to be emancipated in a significant way, not in a major way, but at least there was a critical mass of free black people being emancipated in the years after the Revolutionary War. That is from the late 1700s into the early 1800s in the North. So in places like, say, Pennsylvania and Massachusetts and Connecticut, New York, places like that, you found communities of free black people arising. And it was in these communities very often that you found the germ for many of the organizations that have endured in the black community. The first black churches, the first black lodges, first black, what they call free schools, free African schools and so on. As early as 1787, you had what is supposed to be the first, or one of the first two organizations among free black people. And that was something called the Free African Society, which later evolved into the African Methodist Episcopal Church. The Free African Society, run by Richard Allen, who became the first bishop later on of the AME Church, and a man called Absalom Jones, who later became the pastor of the first African Episcopal Church in Philadelphia. And again, if you look at the activities of these people too, from that very, very initial endeavor among free black people, you find that same spirit of organization, you find that same flair for organization in the face of great hostility and oppression. In fact, the way that the Free African Society came into being in the first place is so illustrative of all of this. And the story is very well known. I'm sure most of you have heard the story, whereby the black folks in this Methodist church in Philadelphia were being segregated, as was the norm in those days. White folk actually came, proselytized among them, brought them into the church, then turned around and segregated them once they brought them into the church. A very interesting phenomenon. So these folks are in the back of the church where they're supposed to be. Somebody in the middle of the prayer comes and pulls them off their knees and says, well, look, we have shifted the Jim Crow section of the church from downstairs in the back to upstairs in the back. So you got to go upstairs. And the black folks say, well, at least wait till the prayer's over. But these deacons are in a hurry. They want to pull them off their knees, literally. And Richard Allen, in writing about this many, many years later, he was very eloquent. He said that they turned around and told the white deacons and whatnot, he said, well, look, wait until the prayer's over, and then we will trouble you no more. And there, in a split second, was an organization. an organization which has endured, the AME Church, and out of which, of course, many other similar African churches, developed over the years. In this same period, in the late 1700s and the early 1800s, you found a whole explosion of black organizations. And when you realize, A, how small the black community was, the black free community that is, and the pressure they lived under, even though they were in the north, in places like Philadelphia and Boston and New York and so on, even though they were in the north, even though they were becoming free, nevertheless, they lived under exceedingly great stress. Segregation was rife. They couldn't go to a library. They couldn't go to the same schools as other folks. They couldn't go to hospitals. Very often they were segregated on the streetcars. This is in the north now in the early 1800s. They were subjected to mob violence. They never knew when some mob would set upon them as they were walking down the street. They lived in segregated neighborhoods, of course. But despite all of this, you had this explosion of activity. One of the great problems, too, that the black community faced, the early free black community in the 1800s, was the problem of slave catchers, especially in a place like Philadelphia, which was just on the border of the South. Delaware was the South. In 1850, they passed this fugitive slave law whereby any white person could come and grab any black person off the street and accuse them of being a slave, a runaway slave. And the black person had to prove that he or she was in fact free. In other words, as the law would say, the onus was on the black person to prove that they were free. In other words, whether you were free or not, if a white person walked up to you and said, hey, you are my runaway slave from North Carolina, it didn't matter if you were free. Unless you could prove, the white person didn't have to prove anything. Once you were accused, you were the one who had to prove, the onus was on you to prove that you were in fact free. You had to go and find some birth certificate or some kind of a manumission papers or something. And that's the cloud that these folks were living under. And yet, in that incredible situation, they were able to organize. They organized what they call library companies. They organized reading room societies, they organized literary societies, debating societies. They had a whole variety of human rights organizations. They even had a baseball club, would you believe? In the 1860s or thereabouts, they organized a baseball club. And this is before the famous Negro baseball leagues that came much later on. This is very early now, in the 1850s, 1860s. These folks had a baseball club. In fact, there were several baseball clubs all over the Northeast in this period. So again, you see this incredible flair for organizing. They built their own hospitals. They started their own nursing school. They had their own pharmacy. They started black newspapers and so on and so forth. In the midst of all of this great hostility and oppression. And many of us today who study African American history, we are very beholden to these pioneers because they're the ones very often who collected the information that many of us can still use today. In fact, in the Schomburg collection in New York, which is perhaps the world's most famous collection of rare books and manuscripts and so on black history, many of the books in there initially came from the work of some of these early black book collectors and so on in Philadelphia, in Brooklyn, and other places. So their books up to today are still available to people like myself who are studying, over 100 years later. So here then you have an incredible flair for organizing. And of course, the flip side of organizing is leadership, the leadership that helps to bring this organization together. So this is the kind of background there. This is the kind of context, the kind of historical context then that someone like Marcus Garvey came out of. As so often happens, very few of us who achieve anything ever do it in a vacuum. Right. The old saying, we all stand on the shoulders of those who went before. That's right. Of course, young people often think that they invented the world and invented the wheel and so on, but it's a very humbling thing to find out very often that somebody 100 years ago was trying to do the same thing, sometimes much more successfully than you are doing it today. So this is the kind of tradition that Marcus Garvey came out of. And Garvey was very familiar with this tradition. Garvey built an organization, the UNIA, the Universal Negro Improvement Association, which was the most successful African organization in its time, and up to today it remains, arguably the most successful of all time. At the very least, one of the most successful Pan-African organizations of all time. Garvey's basic organizational accomplishments are relatively well known now, especially to this kind of an audience. You know that Garvey built an organization that spanned the entire world. There was something like approximately 1,200 branches of the UNIA in over 41 countries around the world. There were over 700 branches in the US of A. There was something like 10 plus branches in South Africa. There was something like 48 branches in Panama. There was something like 72 branches in the state of Louisiana alone. And so it went. Everywhere that our people lived, Garvey's organization organized itself on the ground. It was in Europe. It was as far away as Sydney, Australia. Imagine in the 1920s, Marcus Garvey somehow managed to set up a branch of his organization in Sydney, Australia. Detroit here, of course, was a powerhouse of Garvey's organization. Many years ago, in 1972, when I was in the early stages of my research, I was fortunate enough to interview a man here in Detroit whose name I'm sure must still be remembered in UNIA circles, and that was Mr. J. Charles Zamti. Mr. Zamti. Mr. Zamti had a shop where he sold books and artifacts and so on. Was it on Woodward Avenue, in 6 Mile or something like that?
Woodward Avenue.
Right, I remember going to a shop, this is like almost 30 years ago. Imagine that, I never knew I would someday be talking about 30 years ago, like if it was yesterday. But I remember going to his shop. I was a student then at Michigan State, and I remember going to his shop, about 30 years ago, and sitting down there and talking with him and so on. Of course, Mr. Zampi had a special connection with me because not only had he spent a lot of his life in Michigan, but he was also initially from the same place that I am from, that's Trinidad. And Mr. Zampi had grown up in Trinidad. He had gone to the Panama Canal to work on the Panama Canal. I remember he told me that he met Marcus Garvey in Panama around about 1912. And Garvey was organizing some workers at that time. Mr. Zampi told me that he came to New York. And what he did was he followed the sort of immigration path of so many black workers in that area. They went from the islands to the Panama Canal for work when the Panama Canal was being built. When the Panama Canal was finished in 1914, there was less work available, so many of them began looking elsewhere for work. Many of them emigrated to Cuba to cut cane. Some came to this country. Some went back home to the islands. Zamti was one who went from Panama to New York City. He told me he got to New York City in 1918, where he was one of the early members of the UNIA. Then in New York City in 1918, he told me he heard that there was good work for skilled tradesmen in Detroit at the Ford Motor Company. And so he took a chance. He came to Detroit looking for work around about 1919. And I remember he gave me a long explanation of how he came to be the first, he told me, the first black skilled tradesman to be employed by Ford Motor Company, because he was a skilled tradesman. He had worked in the Panama Canal in Trinidad. He was a skilled carpenter. And he told me that he used to come to the Ford Motor Company every morning and hang around and apply for work, and they would chase him away and so on, but he was very determined, and eventually, I forget how he managed to make a breakthrough, but eventually he did indeed, make a little breakthrough. Somebody got fed up of him hanging around the office there every morning and decided to see if this man really had any ability. And of course, he ended up working there for, I don't know how many years, decades, maybe 50 or 60 years or something. But he said he was the first skilled tradesman, of African ancestry to be employed. But more important for our purposes today, he told me that he then was one of the founders of the UNIA here in Detroit in 1919. In fact, Mr. Zambi was one who mentioned to me that he personally remembered the Honorable Elijah Muhammad as a member of the UNIA here in Detroit. There's been a lot of debate and controversy over that question, but Mr. Zambi told me himself. I got it direct from Mr. Zambi, and I'm willing to accept Mr. Zambi's word. If anybody knew, it would have to be Mr. Zambi. Zambi actually traveled around the country with Marcus Garvey in 1922. In 1922, Garvey toured this country. 1922 was the year when Garvey had his famous meeting with the Ku Klux Klan in Atlanta at the invitation of the Klan. 1922 was also the same year that Marcus Garvey had a very famous run-in with the chief of police in New Orleans during that talk, when Garvey was supposed to speak, and the chief of police tried to prevent him from speaking, and there was a big confrontation, and eventually Garvey was able to speak. And Mr. Zambi told me he was, because there were several conflicting accounts of what happened in New Orleans that night. It's very interesting as a historian, you're like a detective, trying to piece together different stories and trying to tease out the truth. Sometimes you have two totally different stories of the same event. But Mr. Zambi, I remember, helped me to make my mind up as to what really happened that night, because Zambi told me that he was the one who was at the door that night when Garvey had the confrontation with the chief of police in New Orleans in a place called Longshoremen's Hall, 1922. Zambi said he was the one who was at the door that night in New Orleans collecting the money for people who came in. So he knew what went on, and again, he was the most credible witness that I interviewed, so to speak. So Detroit then was a powerhouse of the UNIA. Detroit was one of the major areas organized by the UNIA. As a matter of fact, Detroit was one of the cities that Garvey visited on his very first tour of this country. Garvey came to this country in 1916, March 23rd, I think it was, of 1916. And he spent his first year, most of it, 1916 to 17, moving around the country. And Detroit is one of the places he came to. According to his first wife, AME Garvey, she says he even managed a little problem here. Apparently somebody heckled him during a meeting here and hit him on his head with a stone or something. But of course, that didn't prevent Detroit from becoming a major powerhouse of the UNIA in years to come. So Garvey then built this incredible organization, with branches all over this country, all over the world where our people live. He was able to put together a whole network of institutions within the UNIA. He didn't only build a huge umbrella organization, but he built a whole bunch of sub-organizations, if you like, within the UNIA itself. He built the Negro World newspaper, which became the most widely circulated African newspaper in the world in his time in the 1920s. He built the Black Star Line Steamship Corporation, perhaps the most famous of all the endeavors that Garvey put together. Garvey said that more people probably joined the UNIA as a result of the Black Star Line than as a result of any other single thing that he did. Because if you cast your mind back to 1919 when the Black Star Line came into being, here was the time that black people had lost the right to vote in this country, at least in the South. During Reconstruction, the black people had the right to vote. There had been 22 black people in Congress. But after 1901, there wasn't any black person in Congress again until 1928. So this is a period that some historians refer to as the nadir. That is the lowest point, the ebb, the low point in African American history. So this is the context then, in this awful period of perhaps despair in some quarters. Here was Garvey being able to come and mobilize people to the point where he could come up with something like a Black Star Line, entering into the arena of huge international business, a place where very few black people had gone before. So he was able to put together a Black Star Line, which owned at least 3 ships over the years. It had a subsidiary company which bought a 4th ship. Even though the line failed eventually, the line was not an instant failure by any means. It sailed around the place. His ships sailed up and down the eastern seaboard. They sailed to the Bahamas, to Jamaica, to Cuba, to Haiti. I remember there was one trip where the Black Star Line brought something like 500 black workers from Panama to Cuba. People like Zambi who were leaving Panama in search of work in other areas. Garvey put together the Negro Factories Corporation. The Negro Factories Corporation, which was a subsidiary of the UNIA that ran businesses, a variety of businesses. The Negro Factories Corporation ran businesses like grocery stores. It had grocery stores, it had restaurants, it had a hat factory, it had a tailoring establishment making uniforms for the UNIA. It manufactured black dolls so that black children would be able to play with toys that sort of gave them a good sense of themselves. Black dolls for black children. The Negro Factories Corporation had a printing press. It ran a hotel in Harlem, the Booker T. Washington Hotel, interestingly enough, et cetera, et cetera. So these are some of the kinds of institutions that Garvey put together. The UNIA ran schools. The UNIA branches around the country acquired real estate. In many of the big cities around this country, and in places like Canada as well, Montreal, Toronto, and so on, you had our real estate, very valuable real estate, very often in downtown locations, owned by the UNIA. Even after years of oppression and repression against the UNIA, as late as the 1970s, some of these buildings were still in the ownership of the UNIA. In fact, up to today, in some places, Philadelphia is one place that comes to mind. I believe in some parts of Central America, in Costa Rica, I believe the UNIA still has a building there. I believe in Panama as well. So these are some of the kinds of real things, organizational things that Garvey was able to do. One of the great things he did was that he was able to reorient the thinking of our people. Because Garvey realized that it was not possible to build, material success without an underpinning of consciousness. And so Garvey was doing the two things at the same time. He was building consciousness, and he was also showing how that consciousness could be used to build material prosperity as well. And of course, Garvey's consciousness was based on the time-honored ideology of black or African nationalism. Garvey, of course, didn't invent African nationalism, but as in so many areas, Garvey was able to interpret it, and articulate it in a way. He was able to break it down in a way that our people could understand, and in a way that our people everywhere in the world, no matter where they live, could relate to. And one of the great areas of Garvey's organizational genius was in his ability to come up with a formulation for African nationalism that could break down the borders, the barriers that had existed hitherto, among our people. So it didn't matter if there were language barriers among our people. It didn't matter if there were problems between Jamaicans and Barbadians. It didn't matter if there was tension between African Americans and, say, Afro-Caribbeans. It didn't matter, what tensions had existed prior to Garvey. He was able somehow to cut through all of this and show that there was a common denominator uniting African people. So Garvey was a true Pan-African organizer like none other. And so the basis of the consciousness building that went on in Garvey's organization was the philosophy of African nationalism. And there were three basic ideas that Garvey put forward as far as African nationalism was concerned. There was first the idea of race first, second the idea of self-reliance, and third the idea of nationhood. And race first simply meant that African people must put our self-interest, our racial self-interest first and foremost. We must love ourselves either physically or in terms of writing our own history, interpreting our own reality, writing our own literature, critiquing our own literature, seeing God in our own image and likeness as a black entity. All of that was race first. Putting forward our own propaganda, publishing our own newspapers, our own books, and so on. Race first was a very aggressive doctrine of putting our self-interest first. Because Garvey realized very, very, very clearly and very correctly that we live in a very competitive world and nobody's going to look after our interests unless we aggressively move to protect our own interests, ourselves. And of course, this is one of the reasons why Garvey was so disliked by the powers that be, because he didn't apologize to anybody, he didn't ask anybody for permission, he didn't ask anybody to please come and join his organization. One had to be black to join the UNIA. The application form of the UNIA had a little question there. What's your race? What race are you?
That's right.
If you put on the wrong race, you'd be rejected for membership. I actually came across a case, this is amazing, but it's true. I came across a case in the Caribbean, in the island of St. Lucia, which has an Indian minority. These are Indians now from India who were brought to the Caribbean as indentured workers after slavery ended. And I don't know how this happened, but I came across some application forms that these Indians had signed. They actually joined the UNIA. This is after Garvey's death in the 1940s. And I knew they were Indians from the names and also from their photographs, because there was a photograph attached to the application form. And these Indians, for reasons unknown, in that section of the application form, which asked for their race, I think it might have said something like, are you of African origin or something, and they wrote yes, which I found very fascinating. So in at least one place, the power of the UNIA was such that it was able to actually, have some people of another race actually, wishing and hoping that they were Africans and actually crossing the racial frontier, so to speak. Usually we're the ones who pass for everything else, but in Garvey's case, he made the race such a progressive thing that other folks were trying to pass for us. So that's very fascinating. The second idea that Garvey put forward after race first was the idea of self-reliance, which meant that black folk had to do things for themselves. You know, Elijah Muhammad made that expression very popular, do for self. But you know, Garvey was the one who actually popularized that expression even earlier, do for self. That's the reason why he built a Negro Factories Corporation, which was employing over 1,000 people in New York City in the early 1920s. That's the reason why he built a Black Star Line and so on. Do for self, because Garvey realized that you had to demonstrate. You had to show by example. Of course, you could show by encouraging folks, of course, but if you could show by example as well, that was the ultimate proof that what you were saying was a viable thing. If you could show people that by adopting this philosophy of African nationalism, you could actually do things, build things. So Garvey was very keen on doing as well as advocating. The third idea Garvey put forward was the idea of nationhood. Nationhood simply meant the black folk must try, in whatever context they found themselves, to move towards political power. Nationhood, political power, self-determination, in whatever context one found oneself, but that should always be an aim, to move towards nationhood. So because of Garvey's great success, because of the ideas he put forward, of course he became a greatly hated man in imperialist circles, in white supremacist circles. He nevertheless was able to build this great organization, not only because of his own ideas, but because he was able to mobilize that great organizational energy and ability which had always been existent in our community and which I talked about earlier. Garvey, of course, couldn't have done what he did alone, but he was able to sort of tap into and harness that organizational energy. There were times when there were local organizations which existed before the UNIA, but once the UNIA came along, there were times when local organizations would just join the UNIA en masse. A whole organization would just come into the UNIA. Once they realized that Garvey was on the right path, that he was going where they were going, but had greater resources and so on. So Garvey, in a way, was able to harness that organizational energy on a worldwide scale. I remember there was a case in Panama around about 1918, 1919. There was an organization known as the Loyal African Negroes. And loyal Negroes. I'm not sure what they were loyal to. Maybe loyal to the race, I don't know. This is 1918 or 19. But I remember that they were one group that came en masse into the UNIA. And the same thing happened in a variety of other places. Sometimes you had churches. A minister would join the UNIA and bring his whole church into the UNIA. I remember some years ago, I spoke at a Methodist church, in fact an AME church, in Colorado Springs, Colorado. And to my amazement, I discovered that in that very church, a pastor in that very church back in 1920-something or other had done precisely that. He had brought his whole congregation into the UNIA, and so that his church then became the nucleus for the local branch of the UNIA. And I was very, very fortunate on that occasion because there were people in the church still, this is around about 1985, 86, and there were people in the church still at that time who were the children of some of the early members of that church back in the 20s who had brought the church into the UNIA. And in fact, that caused me to do some research for an article which I have not yet published, but I have all the information. And they were actually able to show me letters that Marcus Garvey had written and so on to the parents and this kind of thing. So Garvey then, apart from his own organizational genius, then was able to tap in to the local organizational abilities of so many of our people everywhere. Now Garvey, of course, was primarily a political figure. When we think of Garvey, we think of a political figure. Somebody fighting for human rights for African people everywhere. Someone trying to uplift the race, primarily on a political level. Nevertheless, part of the strength that Garvey brought to his organizational activity, part of the strength that he brought to his political endeavor was the fact that he was a man of many talents, what we often refer to as a Renaissance man. He was a man of many talents. And again, that's something too which has characterized our race over the years. We have had many leaders like that, people who have been exceedingly talented. Perhaps, I don't know, maybe God just compensates for our oppression by giving us leaders of great ability. But Garvey, is not unique in that respect, although he's one of the great examples of what some folks refer to sometimes as a Renaissance man. He wasn't single-mindedly interested in politics alone. That, of course, was the primary area in which he struggled. But he brought to his political activity a whole wide range of interests. For example, he was a man who read widely. In his book, Message to the People, Garvey says that we must read 4 hours every night. He says before we go to sleep every night, we should read 4 hours. He says we should read history. He says we should read biography to try to learn from the success of other people who have been successful. He says we must read with a critical eye. We mustn't agree with everything we read just because somebody wrote it.
Say that.
Oh, thank you. Right. In his early career, Garvey had already demonstrated this love for reading from very, very early. In fact, the earliest existing pamphlet that Garvey published, a pamphlet he published in Jamaica before he came to this country, is called A Talk with Afro-West Indians. It was published around about 1915, about a year before he came to this country. In that pamphlet, he tells his readers that they must read the works of specific African historians who he mentions. One of the people he mentions in that pamphlet is Edward Wilmot Blyden.
That's right.
Blyden, one of the great forerunners of Marcus Garvey, a man who was one of the greatest intellectuals in the whole African world. He lived in West Africa, in Liberia and in Sierra Leone. Blyden. So Garvey then was a great reader. He was very interested in history. He spent a lot of time looking at history because he realized that history was a critical subject. You remember Malcolm X and Elijah Muhammad both made popular that expression that of all subjects, history is the one which best rewards our activity and so on. Both Malcolm X and Elijah Muhammad made that phrase, that expression very, very popular. Garvey too realized that history was the bedrock of any kind of educational activity. History is the most political of subjects. History, if you control the history, in a way, you control the consciousness. And there's been a great battle around the control of our history. From the day we came here, people have been trying to take our history away. Thomas Jefferson in 1781, in his book, Notes on the State of Virginia, he said we didn't have any history, that we had never been civilized and so on, we weren't human, and therefore we should be enslaved. Practically all the major white philosophers in Europe and North America in the 1700s, 1800s, 1900s, as recently as the Bell Curve in 1994, all saying the same thing, that basically we have no history, we have never been, anything, we have never showed any signs of being intellectually capable of anything, and they've always used this misinterpretation of our history as a basis for repressing us further. So Garvey realized that history was crucial, and so a lot of his reading was around the question of history. And in many of Garvey's speeches, you find evidence of that knowledge of history. On one occasion, for example, Garvey said, quote, "History is written with likes and dislikes." And he said there never was a white historian who ever wrote with any true love, or feeling for the African.
That's right. Say that.
On another occasion, Garvey said it takes the African to interpret the experience of the African. He says it takes the slave to interpret the history of the slave. He said it takes the unfortunate man to explain the history of the unfortunate man. Of course, this is a battle we are still fighting today. Those of us like myself who teach in African American studies and so on, it is a constant battle. There's a constant struggle against those who try to, to just come and ride roughshod over our history. Very often they have easier access than we do to publishing and so on. So any junk they write usually can, make its way to the New York Times bestseller lists and so on. Many of our misguided black faculty members, get carried away and see reviews from these white authors, Jewish authors on black history, and go and use their books in our own black history courses. That's something that has always baffled me. Why have a black studies department if you would turn around and bring that junk back into the department? You might as well just let them come and teach the course. Done with it. I'm sure that's not what all these pioneers fought for. I remember as a student at Michigan State, students taking over buildings and stuff, risking going to jail and stuff for black studies. I'm sure that's not what they fought for some black person to come 30 years later and bring all this junk written by white and Jewish historians into the very same black studies classroom. But thankfully, of course, there are many of us who still have a certain level of consciousness left as we move along. So Garvey then was very much into history. For example, he was very keenly interested in the question of the African origins of civilization, because that has perhaps been one of the most contentious of all issues, because the pseudo-scientific racists, the Thomas Jeffersons of this world, the people who put together the bell curve, people like that,
That's right.
Bernstein and Murray and these people have always, either explicitly or implicitly, but they've always argued, again, that we had no history, that we have no history of progress. And so, if you point out to them that not only did we have a history, but we had the first history, that the world's first great civilizations were in fact African, that African civilizations actually made a great contribution to the civilization of ancient Greece, which is their first great civilization. That turns their entire argument on its head. So they are forced to keep on arguing whether it's right or wrong, but as long as they maintain this pseudo-scientific racist attitude and that we are intellectually inferior, it in a sense forces them to continue arguing that Egypt, Kemet, and these places were white, because they can't acknowledge they were black, because the Greeks themselves acknowledged their debt to places like Egypt. So the white, pseudo-scientific racists are forced into a bind. They have to keep arguing that these old societies were white, because they can't argue that we were inferior, but that we contributed to their civilization at the same time. So Garvey was as much aware of this as anybody else. Let me read a little quotation from Garvey here. This, I believe, comes from the Philosophy and Opinions of Marcus Garvey. I reprinted it here in the Jewish Onslaught. Here Garvey is talking about the discovery in 1922, I think it was, of the tomb of King Tutankhamen. King Tut, as you know, his remains and his treasures have toured this country. King Tut was a very young pharaoh. He was, I think, a teenager or something, 18, 19 years old or something when he died. And his tomb was one of the few tombs in ancient Egypt that somehow survived and escaped the grave robbers and people who had vandalized these tombs and stolen materials over the centuries. And in 1922, when King Tut's tomb was discovered, the world was absolutely amazed at the level of our riches that were found buried with King Tut. And yet King Tut was a relatively minor pharaoh. And people wondered, if this young boy, a minor pharaoh, was buried with such incredible riches, that boggled the mind of 20th century Europe. What must the grave of one of the major pharaohs have looked like, if they hadn't been robbed and so on. So of course, having discovered King Tut's tomb, then of course they began to talk about King Tut being white or swarthy European. It's amazing the kind of mental contortions these people have come up with over the years, for ancient Egypt. I mean, with a straight face, they will tell you that somebody was a dark-skinned European or a black white man. I mean, and they say this stuff with no, a straight face. It's amazing. And sometimes they invent whole new races, Hamites, Semites, all kind of stuff to confuse the issue. In the old King James Bible, they refer to Ethiopians as Ethiopians, so everybody recognizes Ethiopia to mean black. But in some of the new Bibles now, where they've begun to have these so-called modern translations of the Bible, some of these new Bibles now are moving away from the word Ethiopian. And now they're calling them other terms, which still mean black, but it's just that they are terms with which most people are not familiar. So they will say Cushite instead of Ethiopian. Cushite still means black, but not as many people will recognize Cushite. Sometimes they'll use Canaanite, stuff like that, anything to confuse the issue. So here's what Marcus Garvey said in 1922, when they discovered the tomb of King Tut. Quote, "They tell us that Tutankhamen, a king of Egypt, who reigned about the year 1350 BC, was not a Negro, that the ancient civilization of Egypt and the pharaohs was not of our race, but that does not make the truth unreal. Every student of history, says Garvey, of impartial mind, knows that the Negro once ruled the world when white men were savages and barbarians living in caves. That ancient Egypt gave to the world civilization, and that Greece and Rome have robbed Egypt of her arts and letters and taken all the credit to themselves, etc., etc., etc. So here's Garvey, then. He's a political leader, but nevertheless very interested in the cultural aspects of our race, of building consciousness, of rehabilitating our history. Garvey also pointed out that all of the pharaohs were black. Of course, nowadays we know that not only was Egypt black, but we know nowadays that Nubia, which is south of Egypt, where people were even blacker than in Egypt, we know that Nubia was actually even before Egypt.
That's right.
So now we're in a situation now where we could even, for argument's sake, if we wanted to, we could give them Egypt almost, because we now know that Egypt derived its civilization from Nubia. So, I'm not advocating giving them Egypt, but at this point, Egypt is almost irrelevant. We could say, hey, take Egypt, so what? We now know that the first examples that we find of what people consider Egyptian civilization, the pharaohs, the worship of the god Horus, the boats running up and down the Nile, the crown that the pharaohs used to wear, all of that stuff we now know was in Nubia before it was in Egypt. What is considered the world's first historical document? That is the first written record in the history of the world. The first written record of any historical event comes out of Nubia, where the Nubians apparently invaded Egypt, and ran over Egypt, around about 3500 BC. The world's first historical event, historical in the sense that an event which is documented in writing. And of course, this means that the Nubians were writing in 3500 BC, which is 2500 years before Homer, the Greek. It's really amazing how folks have turned our history upside down, and this is what Garvey was referring to.
That's right.
People who actually say that Africans had never been literate, when Africans were literate 2,500 years before the Greeks. They were saying Africans had never invented a wheel, when we now know from rock carvings and so on that have been found in the Sahara. Africans had wheeled chariots in the Sahara 7,000 years ago. Long before anybody in Europe had invented any wheel. And so it goes. In fact, one of the most startling discoveries they made recently was that there's evidence now of Africans practicing mathematics in the Congo. This isn't even Egypt, it's not even Nubia, this is in the Congo. Africans practicing mathematics in the Congo something like 70 or 80,000 years ago. This is 80,000 years ago. They found some bone instruments made of bone near some river in the Congo. And there are markings on these bones and stuff. And people who have examined these markings say that they have to be, they're clearly evidence of mathematics. People are doing addition and subtraction and apparently multiplication and stuff. This is 70,000 years ago. Now, the first Egyptian dynasty is about 3,200 BC, so call it 5,000 years ago. So look at this incredible leap from 5,000 years ago, the first Egyptian dynasty, to maybe 70 or 80,000 years ago. Africans, doing mathematics in the Congo, in the heart of Africa. So Garvey then, as a man of culture, as a Renaissance man, was very, very concerned, that we rehabilitate our history as one further means of building consciousness. Garvey was also a poet. One really has to marvel at the wide variety of interests that Garvey had. Garvey was a poet. He wrote a lot of poetry. In fact, he wrote enough poetry for me to have actually republished a book of his poetry. I mean, a book this size, there's nothing but poetry written by Marcus Garvey. That's how much poetry Marcus Garvey wrote. A lot of it he wrote while he was in jail in 1927, but some he wrote before he went to jail, some he wrote afterwards in the 1930s. And his poetry also gives us evidence of the wide range of his interests. Much of his poetry is political. He has poems written during the Italian invasion of Ethiopia in 1935. So he has poems supporting the Ethiopians. he has poems attacking Mussolini, the fascist leader of Italy, who attacked Ethiopia and so on.
Say that.
He also has poems on other kinds of subjects, you know, on black history. He has poems on the Black Star Line. One of his most important poems is a very long poem, about maybe 20 or so pages long, called The Tragedy of White Injustice. The Tragedy of White Injustice. This poem was initially written as a pamphlet on its own, by itself. It was long enough to fill an entire pamphlet, The Tragedy of White Injustice. And in this poem, it's a long historical poem. It's an epic poem in which Garvey traces the history, you know, of white violence and rapine and pillaging throughout the world, and of non-white people's resistance to white aggression. Let me just quote you one little verse from this poem, just to give you a little flavor of what it's all about. This is my favorite stanza from this poem. Quote, "Out of cold old Europe, these white men came, from caves, dens, and holes, without any fame, eating their dead's flesh and sucking their blood,
That's right.
relics of the Mediterranean flood. Literature, science, and art they stole. After Africa had measured each pole, Asia taught them what great learning was. Now they frown upon what the coolie does." That's just one verse of a very, very long poem. Garvey's poems, like I said, covered a variety of topics. He has a famous poem on a black woman.
Yeah.
It begins, "Black queen of beauty, thou hast given color to the world." And he goes through a long historical account of how black women ruled the world and were revered by everybody. But then, interestingly, he says the black man became weak.
That's right.
And when the black man became weak and was unable to protect the black woman, you know, bore the brunt of a lot of that weakness, you know, by having to be enslaved and so on. But he looks forward to the time when the black race will again become strong and be in a position to protect this woman folk and so on. That's the black woman. He has a poem called "Hail, United States of Africa," a very Pan-African poem looking forward. And again, there was a mention earlier, Brother Kwame Atta mentioned Kwame Nkrumah earlier. And Kwame Nkrumah, of course, is the person who we associate with that notion, that concept of a United States of Africa. But Marcus Garvey, way back in 1927, was writing a poem, "Hail, United States of Africa," in which he looked forward to a united, revitalized continent. He has poems of love to his wife. There's one poem called "The Love AME." His wife's name was Amy Jakes Garvey, his second wife. Garvey was also a playwright. I've been unable to find any examples of his plays. I've come across references to his plays in my book, Race First, and in fact, in 2 or 3 of my books, I have references to his plays. I know he had a play called "The Coronation of the African King." I know that his plays were put on in this country and also in Jamaica after he was deported back to Jamaica. But neither myself nor any other historian has been able to actually find the texts of any of these plays. But hopefully someday somebody's going to find them. I find it hard to believe that there's not some play by Garvey in somebody's attic or basement somewhere that somebody is going to find someday. So I fervently look forward to that day. But Garvey actually wrote plays because, again, he was a man of learning, he was a man of culture, and he saw the multifaceted nature of our experience. And even though he was primarily interested in politics, he saw that all of these other avenues were important avenues for raising consciousness.
That's right.
And raising consciousness, as I said before, became the sort of basis, the sort of infrastructure, the foundation upon which political progress would have to be built. Garvey was a collector of books. He didn't only read books, but he collected books. Again, in his book, Message to the People, which was a secret course of instruction that Garvey gave to his followers in Canada, in Toronto in 1937. In fact, many folks went from Detroit over to Toronto in 1937 to participate in that course. The course is now published as the course of Message to the People, the course of African philosophy. But in that volume, excuse me, Garvey tells folks not only to collect books, but to keep their books. He says, never lend your books to anybody. You probably won't get them back. Of course, there's a time and place to lend. I mean, if one has a, one can have a library or a lending room, that's okay. But in terms of one's personal collection, Garvey says be very careful how you lend your books or how you even let folks into your library to look around. Marcus Garvey was also an art collector. And again, I don't know what became either of his book collection or of his art collection. When he died in London, England in 1940, I remember reading some letters where his secretary, his personal secretary, was writing back to his wife, AME Garvey, who was in Jamaica at the time. And she mentioned, all those books he had, and, and they were kind of discussing what to do with them, but I don't know what became of those books. I assume that some book collector must have come, and then maybe just bought them and then sold them individually as second-hand books and whatnot. But it would have been so nice if we could have had a look at Garvey's collection, intact as a collection, to give us a real further insight into the kinds of books he was collecting and so on and so forth. But we do know that he had a fine collection of books. We do know that he had a fine collection of artwork. He collected African art objects. I've seen references to this both in terms of Jamaica and in terms of his last years in London. Garvey, of course, as we all know, was also a great orator. Many of our leaders over the years, have been blessed with the gift of great public speaking. Many people who heard Garvey considered him one of the great orators of his time, even people who were hostile to him. Even somebody as hostile as J. Edgar Hoover. J. Edgar Hoover, later head of the FBI. Again, in my book, Race First, I have a quote from J. Edgar Hoover, where Hoover says that Garvey is a great orator. He actually, this is in the middle of a secret memorandum in which he is trying to find a way to have Garvey deported. And this is very early. This is 1919, 3 years before, 3 years after Garvey arrives in the US of A. And Hoover is already looking for a way to deport him. As a matter of fact, Marcus Garvey was the first major black leader that Hoover, harassed. We all know Hoover's role in the 1960s in COINTELPRO, the counterintelligence program, when he manufactured this program to discredit and destroy the black movement. But by the time Hoover came along to the 60s, when he was moving against Martin Luther King, moving against Kwame Ture, the Nation of Islam, etc., he came to harassing these 1960s leaders with a whole history of almost half a century. And that history of harassing black leaders actually began with his harassing of Marcus Garvey. But even in the midst of this memorandum, trying to get Garvey deported, he had to sort of step back for a minute and perhaps in spite of himself, acknowledge Garvey's great oratory. Garvey gave a speech at Howard University in 1924, and there was a famous black intellectual of that time who was a dean at Howard, a man called Professor Kelly Miller. And Kelly Miller wrote, after hearing Garvey speak, that he said this was one of the greatest speeches he had ever heard in his entire life. And many other people paid similar tribute to Garvey. As a young man, Garvey practiced oratory. He took courses in public speaking. He entered public speaking competitions. In 1910, this is before he left Jamaica on his worldwide travels, he entered an all-Jamaica public speaking competition. He placed third. I think there was one representative from each of the, 10 parishes, I believe, in Jamaica, and he placed third, 1910. He met his first wife, AME Garvey, at a debate when he got back to Jamaica in 1914 from England. So his whole life then was characterized by this interest in public speaking. And again, it wasn't something that came totally natural. It's something he cultivated, something that he worked at. And again, was this one further example of his wide-ranging interests. Garvey, the orator. Garvey, of course, was also a great writer. The Philosophy and Opinions of Marcus Garvey is one of the most popular and enduring of books by African leaders. And one of the reasons why is because the writing is so exquisite. I've always referred to the Philosophy and Opinions of Marcus Garvey as a sort of a Bible, an African nationalist Bible. There's a biblical quality to it. There's a ringing quality to it. One can almost hear the prophet declaiming from the mountaintop. When you read the Philosophy and Opinions of Marcus Garvey. There are many passages from the Philosophy and Opinions that have been quoted over the years. We heard some earlier today as well. Perhaps one of my favorite quotations from the Philosophy and Opinions of Marcus Garvey is a very well-known speech where Garvey, well, I call it the If I Die in Atlanta speech. You know, this is after Garvey was incarcerated, after his trial for alleged mail fraud in 1923, when he wrote this exquisite, you know, essay, If I Die in Atlanta. I'd like to maybe just quote a little piece of it, If I Die in Atlanta. I've actually heard people from the UNIA recite this speech, you know, from memory. And I guess this was a very common thing if you go far back into Garvey's time. You know, UNIA people often would memorize this speech. If I die in Atlanta, my work shall then only begin, but I shall live in the physical or spiritual to see the day of Africa's glory. When I am dead, wrap the mantle of the red, black, and green around me. For in the new life, I shall rise with God's grace and blessing to lead the millions up the heights of triumph with the colors that you well know. Look for me in the whirlwind or the storm. Those words have become very, 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 very famous, the whirlwind or the storm. Look for me in the whirlwind or the storm. Look for me all around you. For with God's grace, I shall come and bring with me countless millions of black slaves who have died in America and the West Indies, and the millions in Africa, to aid you in the fight for liberty, freedom, and life. Very, very moving words. Words written by somebody who A, had a great facility with the language, and somebody B, who had a great sense of commitment. You can feel the commitment coming through and adding eloquence to those kinds of words. Another of the famous essays that Marcus Garvey wrote that has also become very, very famous, and one which I've also heard UNIA people recite, you know, verbatim many times over the years, is his famous essay on African fundamentalism. Garvey himself considered this perhaps his most complete work of creative writing, African fundamentalism. It was a very short essay, but in this short essay, Garvey was able to sort of include, you know, the gist of his entire philosophy. You'll find African fundamentalism at the very end of the philosophy and opinions of Marcus Garvey. It's the very, very last thing, almost like in the back cover. I've also reprinted it in another one of my books, African Fundamentalism. And let me just read the first few lines. Funny, I opened the book exactly on the page. Isn't that strange? African fundamentalism. The time has come for the Negro to forget and cast behind him his hero worship and adoration of other races.
That's right. Yes, say that.
And to start out immediately to create and emulate heroes of his own.
That's right. Yes.
We must canonize our own saints, create our own martyrs, and elevate to positions of fame and honor black men and women who have made their distinct contribution to our racial history. That's how that essay begins, the essay on African fundamentalism. Over the years, Garveyites have often printed that essay up in a sort of a poster form. Even in Garvey's days, you know, I've seen advertisements in Garvey's newspapers where framed copies of that essay were being sold. And even in recent years, in the last maybe 20 years or so, in fact, I myself have bought copies of African fundamentalism put out by the UNIA over the last 20 years or so, you know, nicely typeset and so on for framing. African fundamentalism. Garvey was also an original thinker. No great leader, as great as Garvey was, could have achieved what he did without having that gift of original thought. Like I said before, his philosophy of African nationalism was not necessarily a philosophy that he invented, but he was able to rework it, to articulate it, to break it down in such a way that it could become the basis for this incredible worldwide movement. Garvey looked at things like religion, for example. He argued that, hey, if God is a spirit with no color, like they say, and if we are made in the image and likeness of God, like they say, then why can't we depict our God to look like us?
Right.
Black, you know, very simple. But as simple as this sounds, as simple and as logical as this sounds, you know, it still required a very original mind to say that. You know, to us today it seems obvious, but it didn't seem obvious at all to a lot of people. The New York Times, believe it or not, took the time, the New York Times took the time to write an editorial attacking Garvey for making that argument that black folk have to worship gods that look like them. The New York Times, you would think the New York Times had more important things to do, but it shows the amount of energy that those folks have always invested in trying to suppress any rise in African consciousness. And they knew, just as well as Garvey did, that consciousness is the forerunner to more material success. So Marcus Garvey then was a Renaissance man in all of these ways and in so many others. He was also a Renaissance man in another more narrow sense, in the sense that he was a great influence on the literary and cultural movement in African American history of the 1920s that the history books refer to as the Harlem Renaissance. The Harlem Renaissance is a term that the history books have begun to use, well, have used for years, concerning that great outpouring of literary and artistic effort that took place in African America in the 1920s, beginning in the mid-1920s. You know, a great number of your major figures in African American literary and cultural history were flourishing in that period, the mid-1920s. People like Langston Hughes, people like Claude McKay, people like Countee Cullen, Zora Neale Hurston, and so many others. This is the period when they flourished, a period which the history books call the Harlem Renaissance. But come to find out that Garvey was a major factor in the coming forth of this Harlem Renaissance. Of course, many of the historians have not given Garvey the credit that's due to him for having helped, but we will, and in fact, and we have, because I myself have written a book here, Literary Garveyism, that deals with particularly with just that, with Garvey's impact on the Harlem Renaissance. Garvey actually had a whole Harlem Renaissance going for about 5 years before the time that the historians usually indicate the Harlem Renaissance began. And several of the major figures in what I call the mainstream Harlem Renaissance actually came out of Garvey's movement. Claude McKay, the famous poet who wrote If We Must Die, perhaps the most famous poem ever written in African America, Oh, Let Us Nobly Die. Claude McKay said, if we have to die by, at the hands of a lynching mob, then at least let us try, if possible, to take some of the lynchers along with us. If we must die. Claude McKay wrote that poem. He was a sleeping car porter on the Pullman cars and the trains. And Claude McKay wrote that poem after witnessing a lynching someplace while he was traveling, across the country. It's, like I said, arguably the most powerful, popular, well-known poem ever written in African America. Winston Churchill, would you believe, during the Second World War, when the British had their backs against the wall and the Germans were trying to run them into the North Sea or wherever, Winston Churchill actually quoted that poem to rally the British against the Germans. Of course, he did not identify where it came from, who wrote it.
That's the thief they are.
That's right.
Par for the course.
Indeed.
Par for the course. Yes, sir.
But all of these people had actually written for Garvey, before becoming famous. And there must be hundreds of others who did not become famous, who wrote for Garvey. Every week in Garvey's newspaper, The Negro World, there was a page called Poetry for the People. And folks would write in, and send in their poems from all over the African world, from this country, from the Caribbean, South America, Africa, and some very well-known figures in the history of black folk actually wrote poetry. And again, just as Garvey was a Renaissance man, it seems as though he also triggered that kind of Renaissance quality in other people too. For example, you have someone like Kobina Sechi from Ghana, who was a mentor of Kwame Nkrumah and a political figure. And again, someone you don't normally think of in a literary sense, but he wrote poems for Garvey's Negro World. Similarly, in the Caribbean, you have a man called T.A. Marichaux, a major political figure for maybe half a century in the Caribbean from the island of Grenada. The same island that Malcolm X's mother came from, by the way, Grenada. And you have T.A. Marichaux sending in poems to Garvey's newspaper in 1921. It's as though all of Garvey's followers, got caught up in this great effort to build up a race, by any means, not only by overtly political means, but also by raising consciousness through literature, through the arts, through everything else. Some of the editors of Garvey's newspaper were some of the great black intellectual figures of that period. There was Hubert H. Harrison, who was one of the great intellectuals out of Harlem in that period. He was one of the editors of Garvey's newspaper. There was a man called John Edward Bruce, who was one of the great, perhaps one of the greatest African-American journalists in that period. He was one of the editors of Garvey's newspaper. There was a man called William H. Ferris, a man with degrees from Harvard and Yale, who was one of the editors of Garvey's newspaper as well. So Garvey again was able to harness the abilities of so many people in pushing forward his Renaissance program. Garvey's Negro World newspaper was a pioneer in book reviews in black publications. It was the first black publication to run a regular book review column. So here's a political organization, but playing such a historical role in the development of our cultural and literary activity as well. One of the great African-American sculptors, a woman called Augusta Savage, was a member of the UNIA. In fact, she was married to a man who died very early, very young, but a man whose poem, When You Meet a Member of the Ku Klux Klan, I'm going to read in a minute. And he was Secretary General of the UNIA. And he had a Detroit connection too. I believe he came from Hopkinsville, Kentucky originally, but he actually, I believe, ran a small black newspaper here in Detroit. I think it was called the Detroit Contender. And that's when he met Garvey, and he came to work for Garvey. This would be, I'm not sure what year, maybe 1918, 1919, 20, somewhere in that period. A man called Poston, Robert L. Poston. And so I'm going to end by reading a little quote here from this poem by Robert L. Poston, Secretary General of the UNIA, a man who had actually worked in Detroit on a black newspaper, a man who Garvey sent as part of his sort of delegation to Liberia in 1921 to try and arrange for the UNIA to move its headquarters to Liberia. And this poem again sums up that spirit of militancy, of consciousness raising, which came out of the UNIA. And I think it's a very good place on which to end this talk on Garvey as a Renaissance man. So here's one of Garvey's Renaissance poets. When you meet a member of the Ku Klux Klan, tells you what to do when you meet a member of the Ku Klux Klan. This is 1921. Okay, when you meet a member of the Ku Klux Klan. When you meet a member of the Ku Klux Klan, walk right up and hit him like a natural man. Take no thought of babies he may have at home. Sympathies defamed when used upon his dome. Hit him in the mouth and push his face right in. Knock him down a flight of stairs and pick him up again. Get your distance from him and then take a running start. Hit him, brother, hit him, and please hit the scoundrel hard. Pour some water on him. Bring him back to life once more. Think of how he did your folks in the days of long ago. Make a prayer to heaven for the strength to do the job. Kick him in the stomach. He, a low, unworthy snob. Call your wife and baby out to see you have some fun. Sick your bulldog on him for to see the rascal run. Head him off before he gets 10 paces from your door. Take a bat of sturdy oak and knock him down once more. This time you may leave him where he wallows in the sand, a spent and humble member of the Ku Klux Klan. Thank you very much.
From Egypt to Timbuktu, from Morocco to South Africa too, we walk proud over the land. Out of Africa it all began. Garvey taught race first. African slavery was not a curse. We can accomplish what we will. Great Africa was great, we are still. Come children, say it loud. Make them know we're still black and proud. Scabba-dabba-dab.
I'm black and I'm proud. I'm black and I'm proud.
Scabba-dabba-dab.
I'm black and I'm proud.
Garvey, Garvey, right. Take her from this evil den. Garvey rescue it from this ideology. Marcus Garvey rising from earth, like Moses speak from birth. Come children, say it loud, make them know we're still black and proud. Scabba